This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. And just to start out, this video contains some delicate subject matter. I'm so depressed. What should I do? I guess I'll go outside then. Love a fork in the road. So I've been wanting to make a video about mental health now for quite a long time. But then I started thinking, because the way we live today is by a much higher standard of living than anyone else in human history. We have better diets, we have better lifespans, we are healthier than ever. But why then do we still feel bad? So I started looking into it. And there are a lot of fascinating theories out there. And one of my favorite ones so far has been, what if psychiatry, and even the entire field of psychology, isn't even real? You're being very noisy. Stop that. Hey, you know how we're just circling the drain forever in a nightmare that will never end until the world dies? You know that feeling, right? That dark feeling that grips a hold of your body. Well, that feeling doesn't actually contribute that much to society. It's counterproductive to the bottom line. This video is about that. About how to not feel like shit. For the purposes of this video, we're gonna simplify things a little bit. We're dealing with the human mind. Things are gonna be complicated. Now I want to start out this video by saying that I think psychology and psychiatry has done a lot of good for the world. If you, like me, have ever been in need of a therapist, you get it, right? Things sometimes just fucking suck. And you need someone to sort your brain out a little bit. Because sometimes brain is replaced with dark orb, and dark orb make things bad. But what if I told you that there's a theory or a way of thinking that psychology is all bunk? And it's a very real theory too. It's not just something that the Scientologists think. And in this theory, there are two ways of thinking. One, that it is scientifically not sustainable. It doesn't really hold up on its own. It sometimes is correct, but that's mostly by luck.
Science is a liar sometimes.
Problem of scientific diligence. But the second way of thinking is that no matter how scientifically diligent it is, and it may be very much so, it doesn't actually matter. Because the human mind is affected by more things than itself. Because as I so often say, we live in a society. Part 1. Psychology and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. No, wait, that's too wordy. Hang on. I hate Sigmund Freud. Now, the topic of mental health is actually very interesting to me because I've had a significant amount of contact with the mental health industry, the mental health sector, mental hospitals. But despite my current state of obvious mental well-being, there has been a time when I did not feel good, like at all. If you go back to my very earliest videos, when I was still shooting with basically a potato, you can see that while I made a couple of videos first, there's like a 7-month gap between one video and the next. The reason for that is because in those 7 months, I had a complete breakdown. Just a complete mental, nah. My brain basically decided to say, no, don't want to do it anymore. It came to the point where even the smallest things ever, like getting an email from a coworker, would send me into a complete panic attack. And I had felt like that before as well, in my early years in university, where occasionally I would have 3 or 4 panic attacks every single day for weeks on end. And it turns out that's not great for your health. Turns out having constant panic attacks is bad for you. And this is before I discovered alcohol. So what were I to do? Well, I did what any history student in mental distress would do. I started playing video games. Now, the advent of psychology was a pretty remarkable thing when it comes to how we view human beings. For a significant part of human history, a lot of people who deal with medicine have assumed that human behavior, or mental illnesses generally, are dependent on physical factors. Something's wrong with the body, hence it influences the mind. And they're not always wrong. The brain is soup. But you may have heard the story about how depression is caused by too much black bile, which obviously is not true. Depression is caused by having too salty bones. Get it right. Now, there were some people, typically priests and holy men, who believed that there was something other than the physical, the soul. And thoughts about the soul had existed for a long time, typically trying to reflect that personality, what made the core of a human being, came from the soul, but that mental illnesses were inhibiting that soul, and they came from the physical world. But the soul is seen as completely distinct from the human body, almost entirely, at least in Christian thinking. And like it or not, Christian thinking has come to dominate a lot of thinking generally across the globe. Psychology and psychiatry, then, are a bit revolutionary, because they deal with the mind, something separate from both the soul and the body. It proposes that personality changes and mental illnesses and other things to do with the mind can come even though you're completely physically fine. Your body may be perfect, but you may still develop disorders. So to start very basically, psychology is a study of human behavior, whereas psychiatry is the treatment of mental disorders. But they're very connected, and it's important to mention that, because while psychologists don't cure mental unhealth in any way, they do help to explain why we develop them in the first place. Which makes sense. If you're gonna cure depression, you need to know why people get depression in the first place. And to even begin that discussion, you might have to start explaining what it even means to have a mind. That's why very early psychology was actually a part of philosophy. Early psychology, as an academic field, had a beginning with a man called Wilhelm Wundt in 18th century Germany, who began a study about reaction times. But it was actually one of his students, Edward Titchener, who developed the theory of structuralism, who while studying reaction times believed that reaction times was just one small part of a myriad of different systems that make up the human mind. Titchener believed that you could study this human mind using introspection. The idea here was that you could break down the human mind into its very most base components of sensation and perception. Everything else that you experience, your human emotions, your thinking, your consciousness, everything is just a combination of these base sensations. So far, it doesn't seem very scientific. You're just thinking about your own mind. And that is a criticism that many people had of the structuralists. But along comes another man, an American, called William James, who comes up with the idea of functionalism, that we shouldn't really think about our own minds, but we should observe behaviors in other people, how they function in the world. Functionalism. And this was praised for being much more scientifically sound than merely reflecting about your own mind, especially by using methods such as direct observations, with the stated goal of using the knowledge to help people fit in. Psychology, then, is a means to an end to be part of society, or adapting to your environment. While structuralism tries to understand the individual parts of a task, such as the steps involved in making a sandwich, functionalism deals with why we even want to make the sandwich to start with. What function does it serve? This became a much more popular view of psychology until our big giga-chad, Sigmund Freud. Freud's big thing, the thing that he's most remembered for, even though he didn't invent it, is the idea of the unconscious state, the unconscious mind. Freud believed that it was actually this unconscious state of mind that influenced your conscious state a lot more than your actual thinking. And that this unconscious or subconscious state would sort of reveal itself using the so-called Freudian slip, as you say, that it pops out when we least expect it, when we can't actively suppress it. And the significant part of what Freud believed was that your childhood experiences would shape that unconscious mind. But if you end up having too many conflicts in that unconscious mind, or if you have too many conflicts between your conscious and unconscious mind, that is what can cause mental distress, mental disorders. But here's where we encounter our first snag. How do you define what a mental disorder is? A quick rule of thumb that many people have used is when it causes a problem in your normal everyday life. As in, you can't live a normal life with this condition, whatever you have, which on the surface looks fine. You have a mental condition that is causing you to not be able to live a normal life. But who is to say what a normal life is? Very early patients that talked to Freud were often women who had hysteria, which oftentimes just referred to women who were too emotional. Today, the diagnosis is most often replaced with words like depression or anxiety. But women in the late 19th and early 20th century most likely had a good cause to be anxious and depressed. You can't vote, you don't have any rights, you're not allowed to do much of anything really, and you're still expected to be a good, dutiful wife to your husband. And the cures for hysteria reflected what they saw as the normal of their time, such as childbirth and pregnancy, and of course, regular marital sex. By the same standards, this is what was normal for women to want under the society that they lived within. Similar scenarios can be seen with doctors being confused by slaves who were unhappy with their own enslavement in the US in the years leading up to the Civil War. Drapetomania, it was said, was a condition that was causing slaves to want to run away. In the northern US, this diagnosis was seen rightly as preposterous, but in the South, it was reprinted, because that is what was considered to be normal. Slaves shouldn't want to run away, and therefore it's seen as a condition. Freud is helpful here, because while he was often very wrong about many things, his theories about the subconscious help us move away from this style of thinking, and makes it more possible for patients to describe how they themselves feel. Freud later develops ideas of psychoanalysis, which basically just boil down to letting people talk about the experiences that they have had and how they are feeling. The theory being that if patients are allowed to do this, they can explore their own subconscious mind and understand why they feel the way that they do. And this also was not created by Freud. He keeps stealing things, the scamp, but he definitely popularized it and made it significant enough where it's even used in most types of therapy even today. And this brings me back to a story that I heard while studying medical history in uni. And that is a story about how mental hospitals 200 years ago in that same university would treat their patients, people who were hysterical or who had other mental distress. And one theory that they had was that rapid temperature change could help, like it could sort of snap the mind back in order. And so what they did was they would go to their cells, because they put patients in cells, they would take them out, put them in a bath, like physically put them into the bathtub, fill it up with water, cold water and ice. And once they're sufficiently cold, they take them out and they spray them with hot water, and then they wrap them in a blanket, give them a little snack, and they send them back to their hospital bed. And it seemed that this had positive effects. A lot of the patients did describe feeling better after this, but there were some who were skeptical. And so a few decades later, they repeated these trials in very controlled conditions. And they found that hot water and cold water does nothing to stimulate the mind. It does not make people feel better whatsoever. But what does make people feel better is being touched by nurses and doctors as they brought them in and out of the bathtub. And having a little snack. Being given a blanket. Those methods, that is what made people feel better. So are psychologists actually figuring anything out? Well, part 2. What if it's all fake? None of these methods are actually very reliable, and they don't clearly demonstrate how to actually make people feel better. This is one of the reasons why psychology has branched into a multitude of fields to try to explain itself, some with more scientific rigor than others. All of these theories strive to improve the use of the scientific method in their work, but none of them have fully succeeded in making people feel better, even in modern psychology. Alex Berzerov, a microbiologist, wrote in 2013 flat out that he did not believe it to be a science at all. Happiness research is a great example of why psychology isn't science. How exactly should happiness be defined? The meaning of that word differs from person to person, and especially between cultures. What makes Americans happy doesn't necessarily make Chinese people happy. How does one measure happiness? Psychologists can't use a ruler or a microscope, so they invent an arbitrary scale. Today, personally, I'm feeling about a 3.7 out of 5. How about you? Now, I think maybe this is a bit harsh. Psychology, I think, is definitely a type of science, but there is a point here. The problem is that mental disorders, much like happiness, are hard to define in the first place, and it's impossible to be objective about something that is open to subjective interpretation. And yet, we still have things like antidepressants, hard medicines. How can we have those things if we can't be scientific? Well, an absolute biologist might argue that we can actually prescribe away these things at all. Biological psychology is a thing that exists, that presupposes that yes, the mind is real, but it is entirely derived from biology. It's just that the brain is really complicated. But we can and will bend it to our will. Is that why Germany has so many pharmacology factories? Oh, Franz, we shall medicate away all mental unhealth, actually. I gotta find a thing for that hat every single time. A biologist then might argue that everyone just needs to get antidepressants, or Xanax, or anti-anxiety pills, or anything really. Just give people drugs, and they'll calm down. And you know, I'm obviously in favor of giving everyone drugs. Don't get me wrong, but I would feel a lot better with that if we actually knew how they worked in the first place. Because really, we don't actually know how they work, or sometimes even if they work. There's this thing in medicine called the placebo effect, which is getting a result out of something that shouldn't produce that result in the first place. This can happen with you being given a pill that is essentially just sugar, but the doctor tells you that it's actually going to give you a little bit of pain relief. And your brain tricks you into actually feeling pain relief, even though all you really had was a bit of sugar. This effect can be so strong that even when you know it's a placebo, it can still work. Which is great, right? But take this idea and imagine how it impacts antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication. How do you know that whatever medicine that you're giving people is actually causing a physical difference in the brain and that is making them feel better? Or do they just feel better because they think that they should feel better? How do you measure how effective the drug actually is? And this is made even all the more complicated by the fact that sometimes it doesn't even work at all. A few years ago, I swear to God, my therapist was just throwing things at the wall to see what stuck at that point. I had gone to therapy for a few years, and I had tried all sorts of medications. I tried a few anti-anxiety medications, but they didn't really work. They tried giving me basically every single type of antidepressant that they could give me, and were basically starting to explore some more exotic things. But no matter what I tried, nothing worked. And it turns out that when you're changing your antidepressants over and over and over again until you find something that works, that's not something that your brain really likes. And after scraping the barrel for whatever pills were in there, my therapist basically decided to explore the Amazon jungle to find some exotic potion that could alleviate my depression. Some type of medication that isn't really standard, but when you tried everything else, you may as well. This was the last resort for my mental health, and as she returns from her glorious quest in the jungle and gives me a small bottle of pills, I take one. And instead of having my depression go away, my entire reality dissolved. You know the feeling when you zone out in the middle of a conversation? Imagine zoning out from the universe. I completely lost track of reality, and for a short moment, I fully believed that what I was seeing and hearing wasn't actually real. That I, in my completely deluded sense, had actually been in a mental institution for the last 8 months, and that all of my experiences in that time that I thought were real memories were actually just my brain playing tricks on myself. I'm having these thoughts in a bookstore roughly half an hour after taking my first dose. Like, I thought I would be a bit tired, not exploring the planar realm. I actually had to call up my best friend and ask to poke her in the shoulder just to convince myself that what I was experiencing was actually real, was actually happening. And I'm pretty sure that's not the intended effect of most antidepressants. And I think it's pretty obvious that I didn't stay on that medication. But today, I'm obviously the model of mental health. Don't look at my Twitter. So what happened? Something has obviously shifted. Well, it's not that I found the perfect antidepressant, or that I finally figured out how to do therapy well. It's a pretty basic solution of not being constantly broke. At any given time when I've had mental distress, it's also coincided with me having literally no money. When I was just completely broke. Times when my diet would consist of eating oatmeal and ramen and not buying anything for months and months on end. And despite that, still worrying about being able to afford my next meal or being able to afford rent. These things take a toll on your mental health. That's actually why I started doing YouTube videos, because YouTube is something that I could work on my own time. When the anguish took hold of me, I could always retire to my lounge, but it also meant that I could work whenever I wanted to. I didn't have to stress anytime. I could make videos in my own pace. And once I started making a tiny bit of money here, at least enough to pay for oatmeal, suddenly I noticed that my mental health became better. Not completely life-changing amount of money though. Like, YouTube doesn't pay that well, despite what people tell you. But enough to pay rent and bills. But that mindset, the mindset of always being worried, always being anxious, is something that sticks with you for a while. Even after being out of it. A while back, when I was a contestant on a game show that Tom Scott was hosting, we were playing for real money. And this was right after I had managed to become even slightly financially stable. But I felt myself becoming extremely anxious and emotional. Even though it wasn't huge amounts of money, it was still enough to make me very anxious about the possibility of not being able to get it. Also, that show is available on Nebula, which you should watch. It's a good show. I'm on it. Although, speaking of mental distress, they did me dirty in this thumbnail. I have no idea what happened here. Tom, if you're watching this, I had a great time, and I'd love to do something again. I hope this was fun. But y'all did me dirty on this one. I don't even know how. I can't even make myself look that bad on that angle. That angle on my face does. You did me dirty. But obviously, there are some things where these methods just won't work. There's a syndrome that some American and British psychologists and journalists have been using called SLS, or shit life syndrome. This is something that describes the idea of basically having, for lack of a better term, just a shit life. These are people who, for one reason or another, struggle with their mental health, but not for reasons that actually have to do with psychology. Put yourself in the shoes of the person I'm describing here. Imagine, if you will, a person who is living in a town that's seeing some economic downturn. Younger people are moving out of the city to find jobs and opportunities, whereas people who don't have jobs or opportunities are moving to your town because it's cheaper. After all, people are moving out. Houses are empty. The rents are low. But this has also meant that a lot of entertainment opportunities have shut down. A lot of the shops generally are pretty out of business now. There's not a lot to do, and your town isn't really facing a lot of investment. You as an individual might not be able to find a job in this town. Or if you do, maybe you need to retrain for that. But maybe you don't have the opportunity to retrain. Maybe it will cost money to do that. Money you don't have. So you end up in a situation where you don't have any opportunities. A lot of people in this situation will start feeling bad just on their own. But some people will find entertainment or a way to sustain their mental health in other ways, by turning to drugs and alcohol or other destructive types of coping. Now, I'm not going to shame anyone, obviously. I partake in intoxicants myself, but doing it to replace life is not that healthy. But it doesn't just have to do with people living under an economic downturn. It can be people who simply have no stability in life, people who suffer from fractured relationships, have no social circle, people who feel insulated or abandoned by society. All of these things are things that you can't really go to therapy about. You can't prescribe poverty or addiction or social isolation with antidepressants. The issues that these things cause are psychological, but they're not psychological in origin. You can't go to therapy to stop worrying about how you're going to pay your next rent. People with shit life syndrome, or SLS, are typically found in areas with an economic downturn, places that have been especially hit hard, for example, by the opioid epidemic. And these communities are also the ones where antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are the most highly prescribed. And it turns out that living in a bleak situation like this can make things feel pretty bad, pretty shit. And I don't blame anyone for trying to find a way to escape that bleakness, even if that is through narcotics. But because all of these factors make people feel bad, when they try to seek assistance for this, what happens is that a lot of times society just shuffles them into psychological care or mental health care. And now, this isn't really a criticism of psychology or psychiatry in itself, but rather how we as a society view it. Whenever people talk about a mental health crisis in society, we often overestimate the power of mental health facilities in the first place. And oftentimes we understand this when it comes to situations of, for example, gun violence. Whenever a gun tragedy happens in America, a lot of Republicans will talk about like, well, it's not really a gun issue. We need to talk about mental health. And people on the left typically understand that this type of argument is complete bullshit. But the kicker is, that's true not just for gun violence, but also for a myriad of other problems as well. Take, for example, the problem of social isolation. Being socially isolated is something that has really damaging psychological effects, and it can really stunt a person in their psychological development, something that can oftentimes lead to destructive tendencies. And when presented with such a situation, I think most people would understand that a person like that needs help, but maybe not therapy, but rather are in need of a social support net. And yet, when this situation comes up in situations about, for example, the incel community, what a lot of people will say that, well, just go to therapy. Just go to therapy. Just go to therapy. Gravely misunderstanding, I think, that a lot of people who are drawn to incel culture are people who have been socially isolated, people who are in desperate need of help. But just as a lot of right-wingers will shuffle a problem onto mental health care, so do people here. There is a rejection of social support and an embracement of institutional support. A support that might not actually help the underlying cause. And this doesn't just happen for social problems. This can sometimes even happen for physical ones. People who deal with chronic pain are oftentimes over-psychologized, oftentimes being referred to therapy or antidepressants, even though what the problem really is in many cases is a physical one, a problem of physical pain. Therapy, then, becomes a sort of catch-all solution to anyone who falls between the cracks of economic or social or physical problems. And sometimes, instead of patching those holes, we embrace leaving them open and just making the pan underneath better, even though ending up there is typically not even good. A huge problem here is levels of abstraction. How far removed is psychology from actual real-life applications of it? Now, you may think that this is easy. You do a study on how people feel, and then you apply that to mental health clinics. But there's a huge distance there. Let's talk about the first distance, just applying psychological knowledge to a general population, because there's a difference between the study of the human mind and the actual human mind. Take, for example, the vast majority of psychological studies. A significant amount of them are not based on a general survey of the human population, but rather students, and specifically students at universities who study psychology. If you're a professor trying to do a study on human psychology, it's a lot easier to just make your class do it than it is to go out and get a perfect sample of the humanity in your society. And even if you did, your society is only yours. It's going to be pretty hard to apply what you learn to a general population of all cultures and societies that are different from yours. In essence, how do you distinguish what comes from the mind and what comes from culture? But let's say that you still poll 1,000 people, a perfect general sample of the population. But it also matters how you poll them. Are you going to call them? Because if you do, you're only going to get people who are stuck in a time loop from 2007. If anyone's calling me, I'm just assuming it's going to be me from the past trying to call my future self. I haven't answered the phone in 8 years. But of course, the other way around is true as well. If you're just going to poll people using the internet, you're only getting people who use the internet, which obviously is a vast majority of people. I fully believe that everyone on Earth watches my YouTube videos, so I'm assuming everyone has internet. But I've heard that there are some people who don't, who live in the world of offline. But those are still part of society. Those people still matter. And maybe the reason why they don't use the internet is important in their psychology. But if you're just using polls online, they're not included. But that means that in the end, a significant amount of studies regarding human behavior are actually just really tracing the human behavior of 20-something university students who happen to take psychology courses, or just wandered into the psychology department, which isn't actually an accurate reflection of human life, even though I know it feels like that when you're at uni. Similarly, in psychiatry, a lot of studies deal with people who are already in contact with the mental health system, which also gives you a bias. A lot of studies don't deal with issues of, for example, male suicide, or why women are more often diagnosed with anxiety than men are. These are questions that you're not going to answer by polling people who are already going to therapy, because what we would need is reasonably to poll people who aren't going to therapy and who might actually need to. And this one level of abstraction is already bad enough. But there is another one, and probably more significant one, because there's psychiatry as the applied science of mental health disorders, even though they might be flawed in their understanding. And then there is the applied mental health sector, which typically isn't very good. You know, it's not a Mia Mulder video unless there's a sad story in it. So, here we go. YouTube doesn't tell you this, but it really helps if you're personal in these videos, because it tricks you, the viewer, into thinking that you're personally invested in watching my videos, even though you have no idea who I am or know me at all. But it tricks you into thinking that you're invested, so that you might subscribe to my videos. And you should do that, by the way. You should definitely do that. You're definitely invested. So, I obviously come from a place of bias here. I've already talked about how I've been in and out of the mental health sector over and over again, and haven't had maybe the best time. But I'm going to quickly tell you a story about how, even if it's a science that works perfectly well, and even if psychiatry is a science that works perfectly well, it doesn't actually sometimes matter. Because while psychiatry as a theoretical science could be perfect, it is still limited by its connections to everyday life. The hospitals, the mental hospitals. As I've mentioned before, I was in and out of therapy, my antidepressants didn't really work, I had anxiety, I had panic attacks basically every single day. I didn't feel very good. And there were moments when I was sitting in that dorm room in uni, trying to write an essay, and I just wouldn't work. Like, my brain just wouldn't. This was also pretty early in my own transition, and if you haven't been trans, it's kind of hard to explain to you the idea that being early in your transition and not being happy with how things are going also doesn't make you feel very good. And all of this combined into making me feel that I had been a complete and utter failure my entire life, but especially in that moment, that it might be better if I just didn't continue with it. If I just gave up. As in what Gen Z calls unaliving yourself. Now that is obviously not great. That's not a feeling that you should be feeling. Now it wasn't something that I was actually planning on doing. It never actually got past the planning stage, and it never became like a real powerful threat, I think. But it was always there in my mind, and it wouldn't go away. And occasionally, when I would be having extraordinarily bad panic attacks, I did think that I was just going to die, that I would just pass away during extreme panic. And since you're not supposed to feel this way, I decided that I would take responsibility for my own mental health and go to the emergency room. Well, the emergency mental health ward. I don't know if this is a European thing or a Swedish thing, but I haven't really seen it in a lot of media. Was my town the only one with an emergency mental health ward? I get there, I get to talk to a lovely doctor about a while, asking me how I feel, asking me if I have any plans to harm myself. And I say no, but it's always something that's on my mind, and it's not feeling very good, and I don't know what to do, and I can't go on like this. It's a very unsustainable way of thinking. And the doctor basically says in the end that, well, you shouldn't be alone right now. Like, obviously the way you're feeling right now is not good, and you're probably going to be safe. Like, you seem to have everything under control, but you shouldn't be alone right now, right? Like, you should... do you have anyone to go to? And this is like 4 a.m. or something. Like, my friends are all asleep. No one's going to answer the phone. So I say, no, not really. I don't really have anywhere except to go home. And the doctor says, well, then you should stay here. There's qualified staff. The rooms are pretty nice. You get to have food. You get to be surrounded by a couple of people. And, you can leave whenever you want. And everything, you just be comfortable for a bit. And then tomorrow morning you can go off into the world on your own. But then you can be around people for a little bit, and that might be good for you. Now, I'm hesitant, right? I don't want to go somewhere with a doctor that I don't really know, but I figure he's a professional, and I ask, like, hey, can I go whenever I want to? And he says, yes, you can, whenever you want to. And thus began one of the worst experiences I had ever had in my entire life. Now, I don't know if you've been to a mental ward, but it's not a nice experience. Starting out, the hallways are cold and barren. They take your phone away from you because they suspect you might do something harmful with it. And with the same logic, they also take your shoelaces. So, right when you enter, you're walking around in your socks on cold hospital tiles with nothing to do. In my case, they showed me my room and told me that I could hang out for about half an hour before I should go to bed. The rooms are completely empty, except for the bed and an empty closet space. The only window I had faced an empty concrete parking lot. The only things to keep me entertained were 3 dusty books that were all sequels to a series I had never read before, and a TV that wasn't connected. With me in the corridor was a man who was wailing constantly in his room, and a woman who was pacing back and forth in the hallway. When I first walked in, I thought, oh damn, this is a mental ward. Who just walks around like that, staring into space? The thing about mental wards are that once you're in them, anything you do is seen in the context of you being a patient in a mental ward. Because there was nothing for me to do, the only thing I could do was to go to sleep as early as I could. But the next morning, I couldn't leave. I was asking a doctor to be let out, to go home. I was feeling a lot better, and yet I wasn't allowed. And I was bored, waiting to see a doctor that wouldn't be there for another 4 hours. So the only thing I could do was stare into the wall, walk around, and ask to be let out. And what happens is, the nurses start looking at you like you're crazy. Even though I think the behavior I was exhibiting was perfectly reasonable in that situation, it's also a thing that a crazy person would do. And since I wasn't allowed to leave, I began to feel trapped. I couldn't run away, obviously, so the only thing I could do was sit and feel scared that I'd never be let out. In theory, I could meet the doctor and he could let me out. But what if he didn't? What if I'm stuck there? Forever. In the end, I was let out around lunchtime. I got home, cleaned myself up, wanted to move past it. But now every time I talked to my therapist, I noticed she was more hesitant to prescribe me medicines that I was taking. More hesitant to continue the same line of therapy, which had been helping me quite a lot. Suddenly, my entire patient profile was cast in the shadow of that one time a doctor lied to me in order to put me in a mental ward. And it turned out the doctor had also lied in my journal, describing me in a way to justify lying to me in order to place me in that ward in the first place. And it doesn't matter how much I try to argue that the doctor lied, because who are they going to believe? A respected doctor or the mentally unwell Tran? So, obviously I never went back there again. But the question is, how the hell do you trust the system when it works like that? How does the system protect the people who fall between the cracks if it just lies to you? And here's that third argument that I mentioned. The argument that even if it is a completely solid science, it does not matter. Because we as a society is shaped in a way where we don't care. And it turns out that this isn't even a unique experience. This happens all the time. And I had heard about these things as a joke. And I thought that, well, no reasonable mental health professional would actually do that. Surely.
Now, all of this leads me to the theory that I mentioned, and that is the theory of anti-psychiatry. Now, the theory of anti-psychiatry states that psychiatry does more harm than good. And there's some pretty good arguments too. Remember what I said in the beginning? That despite higher standards of living and despite centuries of psychological research, we feel worse. Despite more people than ever having access to mental health resources, we're still seeing an increase in people who need them. We're still seeing an increase in prescriptions of antidepressants, for example. And this brings me to a pretty interesting story about rats, which I think is very analogous to this situation. In the 1970s, a psychologist called Bruce Alexander was doing studies on rats to come up with a theory of addiction. And there are generally a few theories of addiction that I think map fairly well onto theories of mental illness. To do this experiment, they put a rat in a cage and they gave them 2 water bottles. One of them is just plain old water, love agua, and the other one was laced with heroin and other narcotics, I think. Now, in almost every single case, what the rats would do is they would drink from both water bottles initially, and then they would end up drinking with the one from drugs. In almost every single case. And this maps fairly well onto the theory of chemical addiction. That our minds take over and we become dependent chemically on the substance. But Bruce Alexander also thought, hang on, we're just putting rats in a cage. They have nothing to do, they're bored, and they don't feel good. So what Bruce Alexander would do, he would create Rat Park. And Rat Park is like heaven for rats. Full of enrichment, various amounts of food, other rats that they could socialize with. Just like a good environment for rats. And he would leave the 2 water bottles. But in Rat Park, they never drank the one with drugs. And what Bruce realizes is it doesn't matter the biology of the rat. And it doesn't matter the choices of the rat either. What matters is the cage. But one aspect that I think is important from the Rat Park experiment is that it's completely understandable why the rats drink the drug-laced water. If you have no other option, what else are you going to do? Anti-psychiatrists then would argue that in order to fix the problems in society, problems such as gun violence or social isolation, we don't need to boost mental health resources. We don't need to detoxify the water. We don't need to make the water better. We need to make the cage better. Because even if you remove that bottle of water, the rats are not going to be happy. They need Rat Park.
The idea that psychology is not a real science doesn't say that it's not important, but rather that psychology is merely a subset of philosophy. A more modern interpretation of this might be to talk about psychology as a subsection of ideology. Because today, a lot of psychological thinking talks about, for example, staying productive or being happy with your lot in life, for lack of a better term, which are very much ideas that work very well within a capitalist mode of thinking. But imagine that you live in a society where that is not a normal life. Imagine, if you will, a society where being lazy is the height of society, where being able to not want to work is the goal. A lot of modern day psychological thinking might take issue with that sort of thing, because being content with being unproductive can be seen as a disorder, if you need to be productive. But imagine a society where you don't need to be productive. And that is not a psychological issue. That is a problem of ideology.
The traffic sounds are really loud. So I hope that this little escapade has been informative to you, that you've learned something about psychology. And if you would like to learn something more about psychology, I would love to mention to you Nebula. Nebula is an online streaming platform that me and a bunch of other YouTube creators have created because sometimes YouTube doesn't do good. It's a good platform for content that doesn't do super well on YouTube itself. And if you're interested in psychology, Braincraft is on Nebula. I'm also on Nebula. I, not too long ago, made an episode of the show Better Elevations, and it's also been Streamy nominated. And we're partnering with CuriosityStream, who, thanks to them, if you sign up using the link in my description, you can get access to CuriosityStream and Nebula. As in, when you sign up for CuriosityStream, you get Nebula as well, for no extra cost. Now, CuriosityStream is full of good documentaries and very educational documentaries, such as What is Reality, which also digs into the mystery of the human mind, which I think could be interesting if you're into psychology. I have no idea where I am, honestly. I might be completely lost.
Thank you for watching that video. I wanted to make a video that's a bit more mellow, and also about a subject that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. Sorry this video was a bit late. I've recently just moved apartments, which is also why the sound is a bit off, and why I'm not recording on my usual location, because I'm still trying to find a studio space. Everything is in flux, everything is moving, but I still think the video turned out pretty well. I want to give a big thanks to all of my patrons who allow me to make this type of content every month with only some slight interruptions occasionally. And I want to give a special thanks to Aislinn, Alicia Crawford, Amanda B, Amara, Amelia Unchained, Amy Lee, Andy Sophia Fontaine, Angelo Garcia, Ashley K, Aster Disaster, Athiet, Austin K, Autumn, Catherine Stenson, Chloe Dollar, Chris Overbeck, Christine Gutierrez, Cobra Sphere, Cooper Morrison, Dana Ferguson, D. Moran D. Arisetto, Dominic Dalek, Ella, Emil Rutkowski, Emilia Clark, Emily Lynn, Erich Owens, F, Phelan, Fox Kant, Gudrilla, HandyCloud, Hannah Richards, Henry R. Seymour, Jacob Alexander, Jane Lusby, Janelle Torgesson, Jareth Arnold, Jay Parker, Jane the Human, Jill Isabel Meyer, Stephanie Sterling, JKL, Jörgen, Joshua Anlick, Julia Helene, Jurassic X Bark 7, LPQ Silver, Linus 2.0, Luna Noir, Lyra Wardrill, Madison Jacob, Marcus Smith, Mari Neckar, Maurizio, Mia, Michaela, Mo Khalifa, Morimer, Neil Anderson, Nicholas Kapoor, Njufbun, OPB, Pat, Remy, Ricochet's Electrology, Rose Brunton, Rose H, Riley Knox, Salmon Moose, Sitseries, Sophia Razan, Sonic Bread, Thoros of Mir, William Fuhustle, Violet Tsukas Harrison, Vivian Crow, Wolfgang the Grand High Exalted Wizard, Zachary Foreman, and Zoya Kant. Thank you. That's unfortunate.